Today, we go over the Everest climb, where this gym influencer refused oxygen and he died after. Ego and a brand built on suffering convinced him that muscular strength could replace what his lungs couldn't deliver, and he dismissed his Sherpa's call at every turn, resulting in a series of decisions so stupid that it permanently broke everyone on the expedition. It was April 17th, 2016, and Everest Base Camp at 17,600 feet was filling steadily as the spring climbing season entered its preparation phase. 14 commercial expeditions occupied the tent city on the Khumbu Glacier, their colored domes clustered across broken ice that groaned and shifted beneath them. Prayer flags snapped in the wind, carrying juniper smoke and the metallic bite of glacial air. Early morning temperatures hovered near 20 degrees Fahrenheit, warming into the low 30s by midday. Among the climbers preparing for the first summit window was Derek Holloway, a 31-year-old from Scottsdale, Arizona, whose physical presence made him impossible to miss. He stood 6'1" and weighed 215 pounds, visibly muscular in a way that distinguished him immediately from the lean, whittled-down endurance climbers who populated base camp. His build was the product of a decade of disciplined training. A former college wrestler who had transitioned into fitness content creation after graduating and discovered that his discipline in the gym translated into an audience online. Derek's combined following across Instagram and YouTube had reached 410,000, built through bodybuilding content, cold exposure protocols, fasting regimens, and a brand philosophy he summarized as no shortcuts. He monetized that audience through supplement sponsorships, an online coaching program, and gear partnerships, and his Everest expedition was partially funded by a $50,000 sponsorship package tied to content deliverables from the mountain. The centerpiece of his content strategy was a commitment he had made publicly months before departure. He would summit without supplemental oxygen. No contract required it. No sponsor had demanded it. The idea was entirely Derek's, that oxygen masks were a crutch, that a properly conditioned body could do what weaker climbers needed assistance to accomplish. He had built months of pre-expedition content around it, filmed training montages with altitude masks, documented hypoxic tent sessions, and told his audience that elite conditioning was the only oxygen system he needed. By the time he arrived in Nepal, walking it back would have meant publicly admitting he had been wrong, something his entire brand was constructed to never do. Derek's mountaineering experience consisted of 3 guided climbs: Kilimanjaro 14 months earlier, Mount Rainier 8 months after that where he learned basic crampon use and ice axe arrest, and Aconcagua 4 months later where he turned back at 21,500 feet due to weather. A retreat he framed online as a strategic decision rather than a failure. Several mid-tier operators rejected his application for insufficient high-altitude experience. A smaller Nepali outfit accepted his $58,000 payment with standard liability waivers. His primary Sherpa guide was Thendup Jangbu, 42, from Tem Village, 17 years guiding on Everest, 14 summits, a career that had weathered every kind of client from cautious retirees to people who had no business being on the mountain. He was known among operators as patient, safety-focused, and conservative with turnaround decisions, qualities that kept him alive but occasionally cost him work with clients who wanted aggression rather than judgment. Thendup supported a wife, 2 daughters, and his elderly mother, whose worsening knee condition required surgery costing approximately $9,000, a sum that made this season's income critical. His fee was $8,000, split with a younger assistant named Mingma Chawang, 26, from Lukla, working his 4th Everest season. The first signs of trouble appeared during the expedition orientation on April 19th, when the operator, Dawa Sangpo, briefed 12 clients on the route, acclimatization plan, and objective hazards. Derek interrupted early to ask whether the acclimatization schedule could be compressed given his conditioning. Dawa explained that acclimatization was physiological, governed by red blood cell production and oxygen pressure adaptation, factors unrelated to muscular fitness. Biology did not negotiate with training program. When Derek's no oxygen plan came up in discussion, Dawa addressed it directly. Oxygenless ascents had been accomplished, but overwhelmingly by climbers with extensive 8,000-meter resumes spanning many years. The Sherpas would carry emergency oxygen as protocol, and he strongly recommended Derek accept it if offered at any point. Derek responded that he appreciated the concern, but would not need it. His tone was polite but carried the finality of someone who considered the matter settled. After the briefing, Thendup approached Derek privately. He explained what 17 years had shown him, that muscle mass became a liability at extreme altitude. Larger bodies consumed more oxygen with every movement. Cardiovascular systems worked harder to supply tissue that contributed nothing to climbing efficiency. And the metabolic cost of maintaining that mass accelerated the depletion that killed people above 26,000 feet. Derek listened, then pushed back respectfully. He trusted his preparation, altitude simulation, equipment, months in a hypoxic tent, a conditioning program designed for high-altitude performance. Thendup recognized the pattern, a client who confused preparation for one environment with readiness for another, but did not press further. It was too early to force a confrontation that would only harden positions. Other climbers noticed Derek. His size made him conspicuous among people who looked like distance runners, and his no-oxygen plans circulated through camp conversations within days. A few experienced climbers noted it with quiet skepticism. Derek interpreted the attention as respect. The first acclimatization rotation began on April 23rd, a climb from base camp to Camp 1 at 19,900 feet through the Khumbu icefall. Teams departed before dawn while overnight cold kept the ice stable. Derek was strong through the lower icefall. Raw power and his wrestling background gave him balance on the ladders that some climbers found paralyzing, but the advantage eroded as altitude thinned the air. By the upper icefall, his breathing was noticeably more labored than leaner climbers, stopping frequently, hands on knees, chest heaving in pulls that produced less return than they should have. They reached Camp 1 toward the slower end of the group. Derek immediately began filming, narration emphasizing danger and physical demands. Thendup checked his oxygen saturation, 77% at 19,900 feet, within range, but noticeably lower than smaller climbers, reading in the low 80s. Derek posted edited footage that evening. The content framed the crossing as proof that elite conditioning translated to altitude. More than 18,000 likes and hundreds of comments praising his discipline. No mention of Thendup, the Sherpas who had fixed the ropes and installed the ladders, or the fact that he had been among the slower climbers in the group. The second rotation to Camp 2 at 21,200 feet crossed the western CWM, a broad glacial basins flanked by the walls of Nuptse and Lhotse that acted as a solar oven once the sun cleared the ridgelines. Morning temperatures near zero climbed into the 40s as sunlight reflected off surrounding ice, and dehydration accelerated at a rate that caught climbers off guard. Derek's large frame absorbed and generated heat faster than leaner climbers, and he was sweating heavily within the first hour, losing fluids at a rate his drinking couldn't match. His pace dropped to 20 steps, followed by extended rests, his breathing rapid and shallow, even during pauses. He removed layers as the temperature rose, but stuffed them into his pack without organizing them, the bulk making his movements awkward. He arrived at Camp 2 depleted beyond what the moderate terrain should have produced. Thendup checked his saturation, 73%, a concerning decline from the previous rotation that suggested his body was not acclimatizing on the expected curve. He recommended an extra rest day and significantly increased fluid intake, then raised supplemental oxygen again. Even using it only above Camp 4 would dramatically improve his safety margin. Derek shut the conversation down. His entire expedition narrative was built around the no-oxygen commitment. Months of content had promised his audience he would do this without assistance. He framed supplemental oxygen as something climbers without his level of conditioning relied on, a crutch for people who hadn't prepared properly. He agreed to the rest day, but made clear the oxygen discussion was finished. That evening, Thendup spoke privately with Dawa about the saturation trend, the muscle mass issue, and the oxygen refusal. Dawa acknowledged every concern, but noted the signed waivers and full payment. Unless Derek demonstrated acute altitude illness or endangered other team members, the expedition would proceed as contracted. Thendup left the conversation understanding that the structure he operated within offered no mechanism to protect a client from himself. The climb to Camp 3 on May 8th revealed the full scope of what Thendup had feared. The route from Camp 2 required ascending the lower section of the Lhotse face, a wall of blue ice rising at angles between 40 and 50 degrees, fixed ropes providing security while the climbing demanded sustained leg strength, cardiovascular endurance, and competent crampon technique that altitude steadily eroded. Strong climbers typically reached Camp 3 at 23,500 feet in 4 to 5 hours. Derek required 9 hours and 15 minutes. Every weakness converged on the Lhotse face simultaneously. His heavy build burned through his calves and quadriceps faster than lighter climbers on the sustained steep angle. His crampon technique, learned during a single guided day on Rainier, was functional but inefficient, flat-footing when he should have been front-pointing, wasting energy on corrective steps when his points skated on hard ice, twice catching his crampons on his opposite gaiter and stumbling before catching the fixed rope. By the upper sections, he was stopping every 15 to 20 feet, breathing audible through the wind, movements mechanical and stripped of rhythm. At Camp 3, Derek collapsed into his tent without helping to organize gear or melt water. Then Dup checked his saturation, 66%. He explained the number carefully. This reading at this altitude, during acclimatization rather than the summit push, indicated his body was failing to adapt adequately. Continuing higher without supplemental oxygen carried near certain risk. The likelihood of pulmonary or cerebral edema increased sharply with every 1,000 feet. Above this point, and without oxygen to offset the deficit, his body would cross thresholds it could not come back from. Derek accused Thendup of not believing in him, pointed to historical oxygenless summits, and insisted his conditioning provided reserves the oximeter couldn't measure. Thendup radioed Dawa, who spoke with Derek directly. Derek repeated the same position. He was fine. The team was being overly cautious. Dawa reiterated his recommendation, but did not override the decision. The liability waivers held. Derek descended the following morning and posted dramatic Lhotse face footage that evening. The caption framed the 9-hour climb as evidence of mental fortitude, positioning suffering as proof of commitment. Engagement spiked. More than 25,000 likes. Several fitness influencers sharing the post. Nobody in that comment section knew what his oxygen saturation had been at Camp 3. Quick reminder, if this kind of in-depth breakdown matters to you, subscribing helps keep these stories coming. Now let's get back to the mountain. The 10 days at base camp before the summit push should have been recovery. For Derek, recovery never fully arrived. He had lost visible muscle mass, face gaunt, arms and shoulders diminished by the caloric deficit that altitude imposed on a body accustomed to 4,000 calories a day. His energy was lower than when he had arrived, the fatigue persistent and sunken in a way rest could not touch. He continued creating content, but anyone comparing early posts to current footage would have noticed. The vibrancy was gone, replaced by determination, holding a deteriorating frame together. Then Dup made one final private attempt. He laid out what 17 years had shown him: strong men who trusted their bodies and died, experienced climbers who used every tool available and came home alive. Supplemental oxygen was not weakness. It was the difference between a margin of safety and a coin flip. Derek listened more quietly than before, then said nothing had changed. His identity was fused to the commitment. Accepting oxygen publicly would mean admitting he had been wrong, and his entire brand was built on never being wrong. The weather window opened on May 18th. The climb to Camp 4 took 3 days. Derek moved on depleted reserves, arriving at each camp last or near last, eating mechanically, sleeping fitfully. They reached the South Col at 26,000 feet on the evening of May 18th, a desolate saddle of wind-scoured rock between Everest and Lhotse, shredded tent fabric from previous seasons, fluttering from anchors, temperatures well below zero. Derek arrived visibly wrecked, moving slowly, coordination imprecise, eyes carrying the unfocused quality. Then Dup recognized from years of watching hypoxia settle into clients. Saturation without supplemental oxygen, 64%. At sea level, immediate to hospitalization. At 26,000 feet, severe hypoxia and sharply elevated risk of edema with any further exertion. Then Dup made his final appeal in the tent while wind hammered the fabric and spindrift hissed against the walls. He was direct and did not soften the message. The numbers indicated that Derek's body was failing to process oxygen at a rate compatible with survival above this altitude. Every foot higher would worsen the deficit. Without supplemental oxygen, he would likely develop cerebral edema, fluid swelling in the brain that would degrade his coordination, judgment, and consciousness in a progression that could not be reversed by willpower or conditioning. Given the readings and the trend, this was not an unlikely possibility. It was the probable outcome. Derek's response came without hesitation. He had not climbed for a month and spent $58,000 to put on a mask 8 hours from the summit. His followers had watched him commit to this publicly. His content, his sponsors, his entire identity as someone who rejected shortcuts, all of it converged on this single night. The emergency oxygen was there if something truly went wrong, but he would not start with it and would not accept it unless he physically could not continue. That was the line, and it was not moving. Thendup accepted the decision because he had no authority to override it. He and Minkma prepared 2 emergency oxygen canisters and masks designated specifically for Derek, adding nearly 12 pounds to loads they were already carrying through the death zone alongside their own survival equipment. The summit push departed Camp 4 at approximately 11 p.m. on May 18th under a clear sky dense with stars. Wind was steady but manageable, temperatures dropping toward minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill. Derek climbed between Thendup in front and Minkma behind, moving up the southeast ridge in the line of headlamps that stretched above and below them. Every other climber in that line was breathing supplemental oxygen. Derek was not. For the first 2 hours, Derek held a slow but steady pace. His breathing was heavy and audible, even through the wind, but it maintained a rhythm that suggested his body was managing the demands being placed on it, at least temporarily. Thendup tracked the subtler indicators, the length of pauses between steps, the speed of hand movements on the fixed rope, whether Derek's boots stayed on the packed track or drifted toward the edges. The numbers at Camp 4 had already told the story. The mountain would now decide how quickly that story reached its conclusion. Above the balcony, at 27,600 feet, the deterioration that Thendup had been watching for arrived. Derek's pace dropped sharply, rest stops stretching from 1 minute to 3, then 5. His coordination degraded in ways visible even in headlamp light, feet dragging rather than lifting cleanly, hands moving slowly along the fixed rope as if the signal between his brain and his fingers was traveling through resistance. Thendup asked simple questions to gauge cognitive function. Responses came late, sometimes with words missing, as though Derek's brain needed extra processing time to assemble thoughts that should have been automatic. Around 28,000 feet, Derek's breathing changed in the way Thendup had heard before in clients whose bodies were beginning to lose the battle with altitude. Each exhale carried a faint wet rattle, a bubbling quality beneath the rasp that suggested fluid was beginning to accumulate in his lungs as exertion and oxygen deprivation overwhelmed his body's ability to keep the alveoli clear. His steps became unsteady, his balance shifting unpredictably as his brain struggled to coordinate movements it could no longer fully control. He stumbled twice and caught himself on the fixed line with reactions that arrived a full second later than they should have. Thendup stopped, pulled the emergency oxygen mask from his pack, and held it out to Derek directly. He told him to put it on now, not at the summit, not if things got worse. Now. Derek pushed the mask away. He said he was fine, but the words came out slurred and rearranged, his logic fragmenting in real time. He mentioned his follower count. He named a sponsor. He said something about not quitting that did not connect into a coherent thought. The cognitive deterioration of cerebral edema was no longer approaching. It was present, visible, and progressing with every minute they remained at this altitude. Thendup tried again, more forcefully this time, physically reaching forward to place the mask over Derek's face. Derek resisted, pulled the mask off with a hand that was clumsy but still strong, pushed Thendup's arm away with the reflexive stubbornness of someone who had spent his entire adult life refusing to accept help. At 28,000 feet on an exposed ridge in the dark, physically wrestling a man who weighed over 200 pounds and was actively resisting was not a viable option. One wrong shift of weight, one loss of balance, and both of them would be falling. At approximately 28,200 feet, Derek was no longer making meaningful upward progress. He would climb 10 feet in a burst of erratic energy, then stop for 5 minutes or longer, swaying slightly, his head dipping toward his chest as though sleep were pulling at him, even while he stood. Other climbers passed them on the fixed line, some offering brief words, others silent as they focused on their own survival. Thendup watched Derek's condition and calculated what remained. The distance to the summit was still significant. Derek's pace had effectively stalled. His cognitive function was declining visibly between each assessment, and every additional minute the three of them spent above 28,000 feet consumed oxygen and energy that he and Minkma needed for their own descent. He told Derek they were going down. Derek did not respond in any way that suggested he understood. He continued trying to move upward in short, uncoordinated bursts, orienting toward the ridge above with the fixated persistence of someone whose brain had locked onto a single directive and could no longer process alternatives. What followed was more than 30 minutes of Thendup and Mingma trying to reverse a situation that had passed beyond reversal. They guided Derek's hands to the downward rope. They positioned his body for descent. They spoke with the calm, repetitive clarity that experienced guides used with clients in the final stages of altitude illness. Derek resisted, not violently, not with anger, but with the immovable confusion of a man whose brain could no longer distinguish between determination and the inability to process what was happening around him. He kept orienting upward. He would not turn. Thendup and Mingma tried to physically lift him and move him downward. At 28,000 feet, with muscles depleted by hours of climbing in the death zone and their own supplemental oxygen running lower than planned from the exertion of managing Derek, they could not generate enough force to move over 200 pounds of passive resistance. Every attempt drained reserves they could not replenish. Mingma's hands were losing dexterity in the cold, his fingers stiffening inside gloves that no longer felt adequate. Thendup's own breathing had become labored enough that he recognized the signs in himself. They were approaching the threshold where trying to save one person would kill three. They did what was left to do. Thendup and Mingma shortened Derek's tether and checked his connection to the fixed line, ensuring redundancy on the clips and reducing slack so that if he lost consciousness, his body would hang rather than slide. They positioned him as securely as the slope allowed, pressing him down into the track where his weight could settle. Thendup placed the emergency oxygen mask over Derek's face one final time, checked the seal against his skin, and set the flow at 2 liters per minute, a conservative rate meant to stretch the standard poise bottle as long as possible for a stationary person, roughly 7 to 8 hours. He confirmed the regulator was functioning and stepped back. Derek sat in the snow. He did not remove the mask. He did not respond to instructions. He did not look at Thendup or Mingma or acknowledge that anything had changed. Pushed across the ridge in steady gusts that carried ice crystals sharp enough to sting exposed skin, and the darkness beyond their headlamp beams was absolute. Thendup and Mingma began descending. Both men were experiencing their own hypoxia and exhaustion, their safety window narrowing with every minute spent above 28,000 feet. Staying meant risking the outcome they were trying to prevent, not for one person, but for 3. The last time Thendup saw Derek Holloway alive, his headlamp was stationary on the ridge above them, a single point of light that grew smaller with each step down and eventually disappeared into the darkness between them. Derek was reported missing when he failed to return to Camp 4 by mid-morning on May 19th. Over the following 2 days, Sherpas moving through the upper route found his body near the fixed line above 28,000 feet, seated in the snow in the position Thendup had left him. He was already dead. The emergency oxygen mask was still loosely on his face, the bottle empty, at 2 liters per minute. The supply placed around 4 in the morning would have run out by midday, and by then the cerebral edema had likely progressed far past what supplemental oxygen alone could reverse. His last Instagram post from Camp 4, captioned as though the summit were hours away, accumulated more than 60,000 likes in the days that followed. During the descent, Mingma Chewang, exhausted from hours managing Derek, carrying emergency oxygen through the death zone, lost his footing on the Lhotse face below Camp 3. The fall tore ligaments in his left knee, requiring surgery in Kathmandu and ending his trajectory toward independent guiding. He returned to Lukla and took work managing a trekking lodge. Thendup finished the season but did not take another client for the following year. He used his earnings to fund his mother's knee surgery, as planned. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now